Hi everyone, and welcome to this evening's Open Rooms. This evening we'll be discussing Tabitha Jessa's Agency of Women. This is a collection of black and white and hand-colored portraits, which she created while she was artist in residence at Hardman's House here in Liverpool. I think I'm right in saying that this was the first residency that the house had as well, and I think those are some of the ideas that will come up in our group discussion at the end. We'll also be talking about the Tilt publication which accompanies the exhibition. Joining in this evening is Catherine Troiano, National Curator of Photography at the National Trust and contributor to the Tilt publication. Naturally, we have Tabitha Jessa. Tabitha is an artist working within photography with a keen focus on socio-political issues and the creator of the Agency of Women project. Angela Samata is an arts professional and previously led the John Moores Painting Prize at the Walker Art Gallery and was a sitter for this project. And myself, I'm Mariama, and I'm the curator at Open Eye Gallery, was also a contributor to the Tilt publication. So we'll each speak for a few minutes about the project and our involvements, and then we'll have a group discussion of around 20 minutes at the end to talk about some of the other themes or ideas that come up, as well as giving you a chance for a little Q&A and to ask any questions. Catherine will speak briefly about the Hardman House and the archive. Tabitha will talk about the Agency of Women project and how it came about. I'll talk about intersectionality and the selfie versus a formal portrait. And Angela will give us her perspective as one of the sitters in this process and really reflect on what that was like for her. So I think if everyone is ready, I think Catherine, if you want to take it away for us.
Thanks, Mariama. Yes, I'm Catherine Troiano. I'm the National Curator of Photography at the National Trust, which means that I sort of sit in a central part of the organisation, and I sort of deal with the photography collections across about 250 places. But of course, Hardman's House in Liverpool is one of our really key locations for photography. 59 Rodney Street is the house where Edward Chambray and Margaret Hardman lived from 1947 until their respective deaths. Margaret's in the late 60s and Edward's in 1988. And when that house came to be under the care of the National Trust, it also came with the incredible and the really rich and very substantial photographic collection. It comprises everything from prints to correspondence to sort of annotated work prints, hair samples, sort of you name it, it's there. Anything that was involved in their process is in that archive, which is stored at Liverpool Central Library. And then of course at the house, which is where they lived and worked, we've got their equipment, we've got their papers, there are 2 dark rooms, there's a changing room, there are various post-production spaces where mounting would happen, for example, and some retouching. And then, of course, there are also the spaces where they lived. So there are still tins in the kitchen and sort of chemicals that we've stabilized safely in the processing spaces and in the dark rooms. So it's the only example of an intact 20th century photographic studio in the UK where we have every single thing that we have objects relating to every single aspect of their practice. So to have Tabitha come and spend some time with the collection and actually use the house to make these photographs, that's incredibly exciting for us because it means that we're able to really see what is now a historic collection be pulled into the present day and become really, really relevant. So towards the end of Edward's life, after Margaret's death, that was really when the extent of this collection was discovered by Peter Haggerty, and that at the time there were massive aspects of the archive that were unknown. For example, thousands of photographs of Liverpool and the development of Liverpool's industry that were just completely unknown because of course the portrait studio was very famous, but all these other aspects of their practice, photographs of Liverpool, their personal practice, Margaret and Edward, they would go and photograph landscapes at the weekend. These were quite unknown, and so it sort of triggered this posthumous fame for Edward that until quite recently minimised Margaret's influence a little bit, but actually they were really a team. They met initially. Margaret was hired as a studio assistant in 1926 when she was only 17 and recently out of school, to work in what was at the time a studio that was co-owned by Edward Hardman and Kenneth Burrell. And she then left after a few years to go and undertake some formal training and came back in 1932. They married and her role in the studio was formalised. She was really known for being the brains of the business, but she was very charismatic. She dealt with much of the client-facing side. She was, very theatrical. She often helped stage the props for the portraits. So much of what you actually see in the images that were made in the portrait studio is Margaret. And Edward himself credits Margaret as being an inspiration in their personal practices because she was a formally trained photographer and he was largely self-taught. So Margaret has this really key role that until quite recently feels a bit latent. And when you start digging at that, it's not only Margaret. There were women who were freelance, predominantly female hand colorists who were employed by the Hardmans. They were sent prints with hair samples, makeup samples for colour matching, and they would hand colour black and white prints and then send them back to the studio. And when you start looking through the prints in the collection, which Tabitha did, you start to sort of pull out the different styles, because it's a very technical thing to hand color prints. These women were highly skilled, and you can start to pull out the different styles that they would put into their work. Beyond that, the photographic studio was also a business, so it means that mostly the people who were working in the office were women. There were so many parts of this business that lent upon women, and so having Tabitha come into the house and into the collection and really pull that narrative into the fore has been fantastic for us. And it's been it really helps us to see how historic collections can still be really relevant, and there are so many different ways of looking at things.
Thank you so much for that, Catherine. And I would love to come back to the role and the use of the archive as well, and kind of the general conversation afterwards. Tabitha, if you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, so as Catherine's touched upon, the archive is quite immense, and going in as the first artist in residence, it was a very privileged position, yet rather daunting and a bit overwhelming because of its breadth and richness in so many different ways. So from an early beginning, it was very important to focus on one particular area, which was an obvious one really as a female going into a Edward Chambray Hardman, as it was known, studio, very male dominated kind of business side of things. Then it was really quite a nice little twist to put onto it as a female going in, looking all the female portraiture, and seeing how much really that Margaret shaped that business and how important her input really was. As Catherine also pointed out, he very rightly kind of praised her, and he took a lot of inspiration because she was predominantly the landscape photographer before they met. He was self-taught, whereas she was a bit more trained in landscape portraiture, which he really aspired to. So the portrait business for them was very much the bread making device of the duo, as they said, they went away for the weekends taking the landscapes, and there's only a few in the collection that are kind of signed Margaret, but she did do quite a few within the studio itself, but it was always kind of Edward Chambray Hardman studio portraiture. It was never kind of specifically Margaret work. So it was really nice to focus on that and take that as a point of inspiration for the Agency of Women project, and how we are changing, how things are becoming very positive in the way that women are now kind of at the fore of what they're doing culturally. And so it was really nice to be able to focus and use this project to focus on and highlight the wealth of women in Liverpool at the moment. They're at the helm of the creative industries, multiple artists, writers, musicians, and so this was a really great tool to be able to celebrate those women within the city of Liverpool at the moment.
Thank you so much for that, Tabitha. I think it's such an important note to think about the visibility or the invisibility of the women who are working in the studios versus the women who potentially were being photographed. I think that kind of leads really nicely onto what I wanted to talk about briefly, which is just thinking about how we've ended up in the space that we're in when we think about photography or portraiture or selfies in particular. I think naturally technology is one of the answers to that. So we think about photography is often described as being the most democratic art form in the sense that it's so easy to do for yourself, it's so easy to share, and it's so accessible. And the way that I tend to think about photography is that what makes it such an ideal art form is that photography moves at the same speed as life itself. So you're in a moment, you photograph that moment, and there's so little space in between those two points on that time map. And I think there's something really accessible and really easy and really fun about that. I think also when I was looking at this project, I was thinking about kind of that value system of photography, of that hierarchy of fine art or high art and things like that. And thinking about the traditional portrait and who would have been sitting for these, and thinking about the social standing of the women or the people who are being photographed. And it's such a formal endeavor, and it really shapes who gets to be represented and who is doing that representation as well. So I would love to come back and talk a little bit more about the archive and how that's shared and how that's shaped and how that kind of outlines the way that we think about that time. So thinking about who was being photographed and basing our knowledge on an archive that is quite specific or quite unique to its time. I think also what's really interesting about this is that it makes me think about the role of the photographer in taking a studio portrait like this. So not only thinking about the location and the context, but also thinking about how the photographer was interacting with the sitters. I think a lot of this comes down to elements and ideas around comfort, but also around control. So in a sense, portraits are something that are done to you. They're kind of acted out upon you. And selfies or self-portraiture is something that is done by yourself. I think control, or even the idea of being able to be outside of yourself and to see yourself and to represent yourself, is something that photography does really well. And in the agency of women, we have a clear idea of who the sitters are because this is fundamental to the series. And the way that that was established was through conversation and collaboration and really kind of co-authoring what those portraits would look like. I'd also really love to talk maybe a little bit further on about that role of hand coloring as well. So in that negotiation of Tabitha photographing other people, that negotiation then continued on afterwards when the portraits were hand colored, and it's almost a way of bringing the sitter and the photographer more closely together. So thinking about how the sitter wanted to be represented, and then Tabitha continuing on that conversation or displaying that kind of empathy and thinking about how that sitter would want to be presented, or to literally have their lives kind of colored in and filled in for them. And I think that is just a really kind of fascinating detail, and would be really interested to hear what other people think about that. But when we think about the selfie again, we're thinking about what does it mean when the photographer and the sitter is the same person? So elements of directing yourself or editing yourself and how you see yourself and how you then choose to share that version of yourself with others. I think there's some curious kind of overlaps around identity and how we choose to kind of alter or edit or shape that through art forms like this. But I think overall what this project does really beautifully is looks at the invisibility or the visibility of the women who were coming before us and the women who are contemporary colleagues at the moment. And I think just thinking about the platform that photography often gives to people, and to think about the overlapping parts of history or the parts that have kind of been overlooked completely. So I think this project is doing a number of things really in a really kind of curious and fascinating way, and I'd love to talk about that a little bit more later. But Angela, if you want to go next, and I also have the portrait ready for you.
Okay, well, firstly, it was an absolute privilege to be asked to be part of this project. I think when Tabitha first emailed me, did you email me, Tabitha? I think a little while ago.
Yeah.
And I was, first of all, I think you question, am I the right person to be involved in this project? Am I kind of worthy of, being included in this project, in, a project with the title, the Agency of Women? And so I was completely, really, really pleased to be asked to be part of the project. And then I suppose it was really from the beginning, from that very first email, that was where the collaboration started. And I think for me, this process definitely felt collaborative. It definitely felt very, it felt like there was a real balance of power between me as the sitter and Tabitha as the artist and photographer. And I think that was something that I really, really welcomed, because as an arts profession, I've spent 20 years asking other people to sit in the hot seat, and now it was my turn. And so it was really interesting for me from a professional angle, for me to then kind of allow myself to be vulnerable, if you like, because it is quite a vulnerable position, I think. Usually when I'm curating things or commissioning things or project managing things, then I'm very much in the kind of driving seat. And for this process, I actually had to relinquish some of that control. But I think the welcome thing from my point of view was that it still very much felt like a collaborative process. So there were kind of several decisions that were made quite early on in our process, and one of those decisions was about what I was going to wear, because the portrait for me was about the symbolism that Tabitha had talked to me about as well. So the gown that I'm wearing is very Grecian, and my heritage is Greek Cypriot. So for me, and I think for you as well, Tabitha, I feel as if I'm speaking for both of us because we collaborated that closely. For me, it was about the gown. It was about the fullness of the gown. It was about the drapery of the gown. So the backdrop is quite significant as well, because Tabitha had said that she would like me to bring along something that linked together my past and my present, or it was something, an object that was significant to me. And so that crocheted blanket that you see behind you was actually crocheted by my my grandmother on my Greek side. For me, when my mum was pregnant with me, but actually she passed away before she ever met me. So that crochet blanket behind as the backdrop is actually a link between my past and my present. So there's small kind of significant symbolism in the images. And I think when we did the sitting, it was in the Hardman studio in the house, and I think we had about 2 hours together where it was about the pose. It was about how I felt. It was about Tabitha's eye as the artist. And again, it felt like a very, very collaborative process. And then we had to think about postponing the project. So I actually never saw the image until the very, very end of the process, and that was the end of the hand colouring process, and the whole process and the engagement that continued between Tabitha and the image after I'd long left the studio. So I think probably the time that Tabitha and I had together, I don't know how long it took you to hand colour this image, Tabitha, but the time that you and I had together was probably about 2 hours, and I'm sure it probably took a lot longer to create the colours that you have in this amazing image. And then I think we're going to go on in a second to talk about my response when I saw this image, but it was definitely the right decision for me to be part of this project. And I think revisioning this process of sitting and for Tabitha to be a female artist and kind of portraying me and having her as a female behind the lens was certainly something that was really, really significant to me throughout the whole of the process.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think I would just love to kind of expand on some of those themes that we've mentioned here. And I think the first one that I want to start with is just like the process or the element of hand coloring the portrait. So getting an idea of technically how you did that, but also in a more kind of artistic or conceptual idea of why you chose to do that. So thinking, oh, sorry, it's quite dark in here. So thinking about the time commitment to that and why you decided to kind of commit to that, and what that meant for the practice and for the project.
Having gone into the archive and just been completely blown away by they're just so beautiful. They're unbelievable. It's crazy that you think that a hand-colored photograph would kind of just swell up so much enthusiasm for something. So yeah, I went in completely unbeknown. Okay, this is a serious skill. And yeah, it's basically starting from scratch. So I had to enter into a kind of like experimental phase where I was trying different materials in order to get a good technique going. And it is challenging. It's definitely challenging. And as Angela kind of suggested, yeah, it definitely took longer than about 2 hours. I think it was about, each one were a minimum of about 2 days, because the particular materials that I was using, which are tints and tones, they're very different to almost like the traditional oils, which I couldn't get hold of at the time. So going down the tint and the tones, you have to kind of build it up really slowly but surely. And invariably you end up with doing the kind of the minor, the tiny little details at the last minute. And so if you mess them up, then you're going to have to start again, because you just can't remove them. So unlike oils, which are quite forgiving, these tints and these dyes that I was using was just like, yeah. You had to be really careful, but it was fascinating, and a real appreciation for the skill of predominantly women who were invariably doing this around their kind of domestic duties. So they'd be given all the details, given the hair, the dress samples to colour match to, and presumably just looking after their own families, and then perhaps all the children have gone to bed, and then they're starting hand colouring. Under what kind of light conditions, I do not know, because obviously daylight would be quite critical during this process as well. So yeah.
What was the outcome that you were looking for? Because the hand-tinted photos or hand-tinted prints have a very particular look to them. Like they're so, like they're really uncanny in a sense. Like they look kind of too realistic, or they look incredibly kind of embodied in a sense. Like, is that something that's adding to the project? Was that an intentional part of the display of them?
I've always been really keen on, so you embrace all the new technology. You hope that enhances your own practice and your own interests in I'm certainly based in film, and I love the grain, I love the textures, and I think I'm always kind of note a handcrafted print is infinitely different to the colors and the textures that you'd get from a digital print. So with the hand coloring, I was hoping for a similar kind of look, and it's very kind of prominent. It's very kind of, it's particular, isn't it? As you're saying, it's very unique and distinctive, and I was hoping for that. I was really hoping for that definitive kind of look from what we always see every day now, is kind of the real harsh kind of bright colors from a monitor or from a digital print. So it was really enjoyable to do something that is clearly a lot more calmer, and hopefully translates that kind of calmness that had to go into actually producing them. You know, the 2 days, the 3 days, it's not just something that will come out of a printer or ping up on a computer screen.
That also actually resonates really, really interestingly with the photographs that are in the collection housed at the library, because having your photograph taken at the Hardman Studio became a real sort of badge of society. There was the Hardman's portrait was a really sought after thing for people like celebrities, politicians. The people coming through the studio were really the high society of Liverpool, rather than a sort of cross section of everyone who lived in Liverpool at the time. and there was a particular aesthetic attached to these portraits which helped them become as well known as they were. And the collection comprises mostly black and white photographs that were printed with this very sort of soft focus, almost whimsical look. And then there are the hand-coloured prints as well. And it's interesting to hear you and Angela speak about this collaboration and throughout the process, because there are letters in the collection where you see people who have commissioned these hand-coloured portraits writing their own feedback, and sometimes they're really, really happy with how it turned out. They were absolutely involved in constructing the version of themselves that appear in the photographs, and occasionally you get people who were really unhappy. And Mariama, what you were saying before about these prints being, hand-coloured prints being almost slightly too realistic and a bit uncanny, there are some letters that people refer to them as garish, and I think one of them said that the only place that she saw her portrait belonging was in the circus, and that kind of thing. So when people were unhappy, they were really unhappy, because I think people came into the studio with very, very high expectations and a lot of involvement, and you don't always know, you're not always familiar with actually what the final outcome might be.
Some of them are crazy. Some of them I can see the circus thing. Like you think, oh God, did that actually go through? Did they actually buy that? Maybe that's why it's still in the archive. But they've different hands.
We did ask for refunds sometimes.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, Angela, could you talk a little bit more about that idea of the relationship between control and collaboration, and how that worked, or kind of how that shifted during the process?
I think it did shift, and I think for me, I just had complete faith in exactly what Tabitha was going to do, and I was totally happy to, I think as a sitter you have several decisions to make in the process. First of all, are you going to take part in the project, and secondly, it's almost like once you've handed over your agency to the photographer, once I'd handed that image to Tabitha, then again, I suppose, the fact that you talk about 2 days spent kind of engaging with that image without me there, and it strikes me that actually that's a very intimate part of the collaboration, was actually without me anywhere near it. It was you thinking about the tone of my skin, thinking about the tone of my dress, thinking about the backdrop, thinking about making decisions on both of our behalf, actually. And I think when I actually saw the image, the final image, I actually asked Tabitha if she would meet with me and talk me through the process, because I needed to understand, because I have to say that I was really taken aback when I first saw that image, because and it took me a long time to work through the way that I felt about the image, was because it had become an art object. For me, it wasn't kind of a selfie. It was strong, and it was probably the strongest portrait, the strongest image that I have ever seen of myself. And it actually really, really took me aback, and it took me a little while to really process that, because I wasn't really used to seeing myself portrayed in that way. It felt like a very, very strong image. It almost felt like quite a dominant image, and I think that sometimes we're not really used to seeing ourselves in that way, and it was really interesting to meet with Tabitha and talk about that process and how she saw that image, because the minute she started talking about her process and the way that she saw it, of course I completely understood it. But for me, the process went on long after Tabitha had finished working with the image, because for me it was a real moment of reflection and a moment of actually it is okay to look at myself like that, and it is okay to feel as if that's quite a dominant image. And when I actually saw it in the show, I could totally see what Tabitha had done. I could totally get it. But for a little while, it felt, oh my goodness, should I look like that? Do I look like that? That's really strong, So again, it was that confrontation of self was really quite interesting. We think we're used to it, but actually. when you have Tabitha producing such a strong image, I can totally see, Catherine, what you're saying about how other people saw themselves, because it is a very surreal thing.
That we've also got used to seeing just a snippet, you know, just our top bits as well.
Absolutely.
So a whole body, you know, even just down to the waist or below, is kind of a bit of a, oh, okay. But you know, I've known of Angela's big presence in Liverpool for quite a while, and she's been very modest about this. You know, she's a very incredibly inspirational woman, and I just felt that image was completely apt. You know, she came in, oh, take pictures of me with my hands in my pockets, because I've always got my hands in my pockets, and like, you know, with a cheeky little grin. Yeah, great, but hang on, there's this Angela Samata is an incredibly strong female role model for so many people, and she completely forgot about that. She didn't take that into account. And why on earth would I not want to kind of capture, or hope to try and capture that, the Angela that I see?
Yeah, that is definitely the beauty of photography, isn't it? Being able to see yourself the way that other people see you, which is, yeah, sometimes a rare occurrence, but it's a definite, yeah, it's good to have that as a reset.
But I think it's quite interesting, because some of the language that I associate with painting, I've worked around paintings for 20 years. So some of the language that I associate with painting was actually part of our conversation, wasn't it, Tabitha? It was the you know, that language of the creative process that went on way after I left the, you know, Hardman House. So again, the language that we were using and the interpretation was not, that for me was not really related to photography. It was much more related to the process of painting and sitting for a painting, actually, which I just found absolutely fascinating.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you selected the women to sit for your project, and how you even described the project to them from the beginning.
So a celebration of those, because out of all the museums, the galleries, the big cultural establishments in Liverpool, only one is run by a male, which is tremendous. I don't think no, I can remember a time when there was a few of those that were run by men, but predominantly I think culture in Liverpool has always had a very strong female presence. And I don't really, you know, perhaps it needs to be observed whether it's relevant everywhere else. As you know, is this a kind of a unique kind of setup? Probably not, but you know, how many people are aware of that, all these, you know, the museums of Liverpool, FACT, Tate Liverpool, are all led by women. It's great. So to be able to kind of to champion that, and to get some artists and other creatives established and emerging as well to sit for the project was a great opportunity. A celebration, a positive celebration of women. Why not? Because, you know, as we've touched upon already, then historically the male has always dominated that you know, that forward facing kind of focal point. So yeah, it's good to be able to change that, to move forward.
And I was also wondering just about the archives themselves as well. So the idea of working with an archive and having this huge body of work behind you, and thinking about how to work that into your own project, or using that as inspiration or as parameters or boundaries for what you were doing. Did you ever feel like the archive was a burden in that sense, or was it always just a source of inspiration and creativity for you?
A source of inspiration, but because I've just completely immersed myself in it right at the very beginning, took digital shots of everything that I kind of, as soon as I got that focal point of the female portraiture, you had to kind of narrow it down quite rapidly. Otherwise it would become overwhelming, and it just cause chaos, and you wouldn't get anywhere. But anyway, but so taking the portraiture, but also with a nod to the landscape, and kind of just nudging, and sort of a nice little nod to that with some of the portraits where I've included and combined some landscapes of my own into that, as they were such passionate landscape artists, both of them. So that's nice to be able to celebrate and to see that side of them as well.
And I think for me, Mariama, part of the reason why I said yes to the project was the elevation of part of the archive. Actually, it was the elevation of the women. It was the elevation of the process that the women took part in, and it was the elevation for me of that real working class work. The women were taking care of their children often, and were doing this work often when it was light, as Tabitha said. So for me, my decision to take part in the process was actually firmly rooted in the archive, and really elevating the part of the process which sometimes hasn't been the focus. The focus was not necessarily the women. So the archive for me as a sitter was really fundamental in my decision to say yes to the project.
Thank you so much for that. Does anyone else have any questions or anything else that they want to add in?
I would just add as well that actually from the perspective of the collection, it's also really great to see the focus on the studio portraits, because actually, Mariam, before you mentioned value systems of photography and which images have we historically valued, what's the collection best known for, how has Tabitha's work sort of changed that narrative a little bit. And actually the part of the collection that's been probably most talked about and most valued over the years are the landscape portraits, because it fit better within the canon of the history of photography as it was developed in the 80s and 90s in many ways. But the portraits were, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And it really, Tabitha, as you said before, it was the bread and butter of their business. So being able to actually celebrate the portraits and not see them as the sort of commercial side of the business. Often when you think about photography, there's this way of thinking about anything commercial as like, oh no, it's commercial, and we want to think about these high art images that were created as very intentionally artistic images, which for the Hardmans, fall much more clearly with the landscapes and still lifes and that type of work that they also made in their free time. But I'm really pleased that we're able to put the focus on the portrait photography and celebrate that, but bringing in, as you said before, Tabitha, aspects of their love for landscape, which really drove a lot of decisions around their business, because they were facilitating this personal side of their practice in many ways through the commercial work.
I think it must be said as well that there's tremendous skill behind what they were able to do in the studio. They are absolutely stunning portraits, and albeit commercial, but they're of a very high standard, and you can see why it was, they were the studio to visit if you could afford it, and they were very expensive even at the time. But you pay for what you get sometimes, and it's true. So they were, very skilled at what they did.
Absolutely, and thinking from a history of portraiture perspective as well, when you go, as you know, Tabitha, when you look through the collection, there are negatives, there are work prints with areas cut out and repasted, there are annotations, there are all different manner of objects that were used to colour match for the hand-coloured prints. There are prints that they didn't like, and they would write notes on about why they didn't like them, and reprint them and annotate them all over again. So also from a history of portraiture, history of photography perspective, there's an enormous amount that we can and do and will continue to learn from the portraits in the collection. So it's, as I said, it's fantastic to see this real focus on the portraiture as a part of their practice, and in a way that really pulls it into the cultural environment of today.
Absolutely. I think it's a really nice note to end on, the idea of making women and their invisible kind of domestic labor a bit more visible, and really singing our praises to the cultural sector, particularly in the Northwest and in Liverpool. Thank you again to everyone. Thank you for all of your thoughts and your time and your energy on this. This has been really fun and really illuminating. And I think, yeah, I just want to thank you again for that.
Thank you, Mariama.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Enjoy your evenings.